Hello there, and welcome to Charles Circle. We just wrapped up a 42 episode Let's Play of the indie factory game by Mafi Studios, Captain of Industry, which we played during the first few months of Early Access Update 3. This video contains two parts. One, a tour of our final base at the end of this playthrough, and two, some reflections, lessons learned, and tips and tricks gathered over the course of this roughly 200-hour playthrough. I'm thinking about this video as a cover page for the series, so to speak. So if you've been following along this whole time, hopefully this helps put a bow on it and you enjoy one last spin through the island. Conversely, if this is the first you're seeing of the series, here's hoping it sparks or reignites your interest in the game. Bonus points if it inspires you to check out our playthrough, which we'll link to for your convenience. In case you aren't familiar, Captain of Industry shipwrecks you on an island, and you're forced to build a base capable of repairing your ship. You then explore the surrounding islands, conduct research and trade, and upgrade your island all the way up to the point of putting a space station in orbit and corralling asteroids to crash down onto your island so that you can extract their minerals. It's a brilliant sandbox game in that you start with a completely blank page, but by the time you've finished, what you've created is completely unique. Even if it has commonalities with other players' bases or your own previous ones, it's guaranteed to have diverged so much that no two playthroughs are ever quite the same. We started out on the default beginner map called New Haven, and as you can see, 1,000 years later, our island looks a lot different. So let's dive into the base tour section of the video. So, welcome. The date is January 1st, 1000. We have 9,200 population. Our tech tree is substantially complete with a few minor exceptions. We have a level 6 space station with asteroid dropping capabilities, and according to the save file, have launched successfully just short of 300 rockets from our spaceport. Now that we have established the date, I will unpause to make the base feel alive as we tour around. We actually wrapped up our final episode a couple years ago in game time, but I took a little bit of time to polish up some aesthetics here and there. I had to force myself to time box it and call it on January 1st, 1000 because otherwise I would never stop. It's that kind of a game. There's always something to improve, to tweak, something to react to, something else to plan. In 4X terms, it's definitely got that one more turn dynamic that's hard to pull back from. So let's quickly orient ourselves to the overall layout of the base. We certainly rebuilt parts here and there, but for the most part, this is the layout that developed organically over the course of the playthrough. So you can definitely see the tree rings of development, so to speak, as we advance through the years, much like a city itself grows organically over many years in real life. So generally, you can see that where there is paving, we are developed, and where there is not paving yet, we have not developed yet. So generally speaking, most of what we have built is along these coastlines, and spreading out in this direction somewhat. And of course, we do have a bit of an outpost up this way. But generally speaking, we are definitely concentrated in this area because that's where you spawn. Spawning, at the center of it all, of course, right at the very beginning, is the shipyard, which, to the best of my recollection, remains exactly where it was at the beginning of the game. As does our settlement, actually, although it's obviously upgraded and expanded since then. Our various consumer industries are also part of this settlement district, I would say. So we provide household goods and appliances here and here, as well as luxury goods here. We also supply medical supplies here, only up to medical supplies 2, for whatever that's worth, and consumer electronics out this way, as well as the internet, I suppose. The other sort of mini district adjacent to the settlement is our market district, where we receive by train all of the food goods that we produce across the map, which we'll touch on in a moment. Between these two, the set of consumer industries and the market district, we provide everything that our citizens want. So we have the full bonus from all of the services that you can produce. We have all of the foods that you can produce, although admittedly our stockpiles on treats are looking slightly sketchy in the moment. We'll ignore that for the time being. The Last piece to touch on in the settlement district area is the trash processing, the water supply, and the wastewater treatment, which I sort of all lump together in this single general zone. The water, of course, comes from recycling the wastewater, but you still have to backfill that somewhat, and that is done from this coastal desalination setup here across the street. Speaking of streets, the next district that developed in our playthrough was this big north-south avenue, which we've been referring to as Broad Street throughout our playthrough. This avenue has been the heart of our manufacturing zone really since day one when we placed our first smelters and assemblies. It was designed overall with the import and export storages being pretty close to each other to minimize the amount of trips and traffic that our truck network would have to take. So, starting at the south end of the avenue and working our way north, I suppose, we have first our transportation sector with our train and vehicle depots and the supporting vehicle parts 2 and 3 production, the excess of which we use to export via contracts. More on that in a bit. It's also connected directly to a short shuttle train that brings in electronics 2 from a factory down this way that we'll talk about in a little bit. This storage indirectly supplies anywhere in this area that needs it, consumer goods, research, etc., but it is also directly connected both to our vehicle depot, but also to our biggest consumer of electronics 2 in this area, which is our construction parts factory. Speaking of which, this footprint of this construction parts plant is exactly the same as we built it all the way back in episode 2. I advertised it then as our first permanent build, and we don't do clickbait here at Charles Circle. I'm a man of my word. We upgraded it all the way up to level 5 assemblies and added advanced construction part modules for 3 and 4 as we unlock those techs, but this build got us all the way through the game. As part of this plant, it produces electronics 1, which we export the excess of to the rest of the base, but that electronics, along with the steel input that it shares for construction parts 3 and the basic construction parts, that steel is also turned into mechanical parts over here, and the mechanical parts are paired with the electronics and electronics 2 from that train station to supply these 2 modules, which are our maintenance 1 and 2 facilities, respectively. These have been sufficient, really the entire game. Depending on exactly which edicts we're running, we sometimes have to boost one of these machines in the maintenance 1 module. But other than that, this has been plenty sufficient, which is great. I was a little bit surprised by that, to be honest, but we'll certainly take it. Across the street is our R&D facility, this general zone, I would say. Another old school build. These 4 labs have been with us since episode 5, I think. And we've certainly, expanded the supporting lab equipment production every time that we've upgraded the labs themselves. But this has been here really since we started researching in earnest. I told you we took our space station all the way up to level 6, by the way, because that's the level where you generate enough space research points to maintain 4 labs continuously. As a brief aside, I normally only build 3 labs in my playthroughs. This was the first time I've ever added a 4th, and I do think 4 is probably overkill. It was a nice luxury to be able to cruise through some key technologies from time to time, but we also spent a lot of time idling these labs. Usually not because we couldn't supply them, but because we already had a bunch of tech unlocked that we couldn't afford to implement yet. So I think 3 is probably the sweet spot, but if you're good about picking the right techs in the right order and can keep them both at 100% utilization, or just aren't in a hurry to progress, I actually think 2 labs is also quite doable. Now I only bother splitting hairs here because research labs are very expensive to maintain, right? Workers, Unity, later on compute, electricity, maintenance 3, etc. So I think it is worth being intentional with how much you build here, doubly so even when you consider the infrastructure required over here to sort of maintain and supply them, but I digress. The remainder of Broad Street is made up of our various early game smelting arrays. So, starting over here, this copper supply exports to the rest of the base via this storage, but is also, with higher priority, directly inputting into the Electronics 1 module of our construction parts factory, and that is definitely the biggest consumer of this copper supply. Because this copper shares a lot of inputs with glass, sand being one, acid being another, we've paired them up in this same zone. Over time, these turned into arc furnace 2s, and so they end up sharing even more infrastructure via the water recycling loop and the shared graphite input, etc. So this has continued to be a helpful pairing for us over the course of the game, and so we've maintained it. Notably though, across the street not using arc furnaces is our primary steel production. Now I explain my thoughts on this ad nauseum throughout the series, so I promise I will leave my soapbox off to the side, but the 10-second version of this is that arc furnaces are insanely expensive in terms of electricity. They require the water and steam recycling loop setup, and most importantly to me, they can't be boosted with Unity. So that means that compared to a boosted Blast Furnace 2, they're actually a decrease in throughput. And that's Arc Furnace 2s. So don't get me started on Arc Furnace 1s, right? Like, in theory, that's supposed to be 2 upgrades better than this Blast Furnace 2. So I said I would leave my soapbox off to the side, so I'll stop, but generally my philosophy is if and only if power is no longer a concern for you. Typically the nuclear tech is the big jump here that unlocks that for people strategically. Any new capacity I need to build after that point, I'll do using arc furnaces as long as my graphite consumption is roughly balanced against exhaust scrubbers and CO2 capacity for generating those graphite rods. And that's exactly what this additional steel module is up here. These, of course, are arc furnace 2s coming from the same supply of iron ore. Both of these modules are today supplied oxygen-wise through this array of electrolyzers. These split water into oxygen and hydrogen, also using quite a bit of power, but the byproduct hydrogen is pretty convenient. So we take that and we export it to the rest of the base as well. Back across the street to round out the manufacturing zone is our concrete slabs factory. Factory feels like an oversell here, it's just 4 machines at the very end, but it's actually been sufficient for us for the entire playthrough, really. This is yet another OG build in this area, with an identical footprint going all the way back to when we built it in episode 4, I want to say. It prioritizes, through this series of stacked balancers, production from waste products like slag and rock, but it will absolutely backfill with sand if and when we need it to. Now, I actually think, yes, I have the whole thing boosted right now, which is another nice thing that you can do, of course, but we actually generally haven't needed to do that throughout the playthrough too much. I just wanted to get in some last-minute paving right before this episode. So, as you can see, we've done a lot of paving, and of course, concrete slabs also are a key input into construction parts, which we make a ton of. This has been really, frankly, sufficient for the entire game, which is pretty impressive. So, capping the Broad Street manufacturing zone and really feeding it for most of the game is this sort of train import zone. Sadly, this is actually the least busy this area has been over the course of the playthrough because we've migrated away from direct extraction of resources and into, generally speaking, the import via contracts for a lot of our supply. Now, we do still bring in from the northern mining areas some of these coal, iron, and copper come in some volumes here. So it's still important, and we still obviously operate it, but it used to be busier. But that is the natural course or evolution of your economy over the game in Captain of Industry. So be it. There's also integrated recycling in this area. So our two biggest producers of recyclables are research labs, which really crank them out towards the end of the game here. These, because they're intermittent, also merge up with a buffer that also takes into account the recyclables produced by the settlement itself. And between those two sources, these two sorters are sufficient. And of course, it outputs all of the different recycled goods, and directly, since we're right next to this steel plant, directly inputs with priority to this smelter array for iron. The same is true over here. The maintenance area is our biggest generator of recyclables out here, and it feeds into these two. And this has the most leftover capacity, and so it takes anything else scavenged from around the base as well. But then these output into, of course, these 5 buckets. This time it's copper that's connected directly to the smelting array. So that integrated recycling setup is something that I actually hadn't tried before. I have generally done like a single recycling center, which is also very fun. It comes with its own trade-offs as well. I think the biggest advantage about the way that we've laid out this entire region, this entire zone, is yes, we use trucks to transport things, but very short distances, right? If you need to bring, glass down here, great, it's just down the street, right? If you got to bring the recycling, okay, no problem, it's right across the street. The other one that we have here is a small array of resmelting gold. This is only the recycled recipe and is directly connected out here. Small volumes, small buildings, easy to put this here. And we tacked on an aluminum recycler out this way. So everything is generally in this region, which has meant good things for our truck network in general. So the next region to develop, sequentially, over the course of our playthrough, is our refinery zone, which I would say the core is right here in this area, but depending on how you want to define it, you could say expands out even through here across this street and set of tracks. Our initial refinery setup actually lasted us quite a while. We built it in episode 9 as we were running out of oil, and then it took until episode 39, I think, until we were forced to remodel it finally. And we kept it in this same footprint when we did remodel it. I think the refinery is the build that fundamentally has to change the most over the course of your playthrough, since the mix of byproducts that you want to produce evolves naturally over the course of the game. And it's not always in ways you can perfectly predict from the start. So I do feel pretty good that it lasted as long as it did, but it definitely needed this iteration by the end of the game. And this iteration still does solve primarily for diesel production. Our trucks and trains still run on diesel, but it also supplies naphtha, which again, you can't be producing in your initial iteration, even if you leave space for it, which we did. That naphtha comes across the street here and supplies our plastic. It also comes down the row and supplies our rubber production. From there, everything else gets cracked down. So heavy oil runs primarily these boilers that supply the steam to this area, but the excess of that gets cracked down into naphtha if we still need more naphtha. If not, it and excess naphtha both get cracked down into diesel, and all the fuel gas that we supply here out to the rest of the base for things like our cement factory, our statue of maintenance, so on and so forth. If there's any excess fuel gas generated either here directly in the refinery or elsewhere in the base, you can drop it off here. We'll crack that down into hydrogen. We do also produce, of course, a significant amount of our own sour water from these processes, but whenever we have room for it, we backfill additional sour water using the good old trusty slag for sour water contract that everyone knows and loves. And that allows us to make sure that we have a continuous supply of both ammonia and sulfur to the rest of the base, which is very important in general, but also directly across the street, it's important for the fertilizer array, which I would consider part of the refinery, even if it's not the core oil processing component. This modest setup produces more fertilizer too than we can consume, and that is sent via a pair of trains all the way over to our farming setup, which we'll touch on in a little bit. Continuing west, the next thing we ended up building is our advanced electronics factory. Initially built when we unlocked Electronics 2, we've expanded this factory's throughput several times over the course of the game to keep up with the rapid increase in consumption as you progress through the tech tree. Given the volumes of raw inputs that we needed to make this massive set of Electronics 2, it made sense right away to build integrated copper supply, same with glass and silica, rather than trucking it across the map. So we put this all within the factory footprint because we figured it might as well be on site. And because we make 240 Electronics 2 per minute that need to be transported across the base to where they are actually consumed, as I mentioned, we have this little shuttle train. He's very cute, and I'm glad we kept it. It's probably not strictly mandatory here, but I do think it still provides a bit of value, even though it's only a 4-car train, because flat goods, right, otherwise have to be transported by the basic truck, because there's no mega vehicle capable of transporting flat goods the way that you can with loose or fluids. So later in, we added the microchip array over here so that we could supply Electronics 3 as well with overflow Electronics 2. Initially, we built these 3 machines just to jumpstart that microchip producing process, but now we have this entire expanded array of 12 machines. The way that we've done this, in short, is that the water and acid steps are done by these 3 machines, the copper and plastic steps done by these 4 machines, and the gold stamping is done on this row of 4. So initially, we used a recycling loop, not a recycling loop, but a recycling loop, I guess, to bring back, 4 times the microchip until it was complete. But as we expanded this, we've actually made this row just do the very first 3 steps directly off the silicon wafer. So it churns those out, and then these 3 rows, actually this time 3 rows, are identical, and they recirculate until it is a final microchip, in which case it will be sorted off to the side here and then sent out to be merged up with some Electronics 2 to make Electronics 3. As you can see, we have decent buffers of both. Now, given the sort of location of Electronics 3 out here already, this is where we put our Maintenance 3 module. Especially early on, it doesn't take very much Electronics 3 to operate your Maintenance 3 modules. And in fact, I think we've only very recently had to justify adding a 3rd machine here. So we figured it's small volumes, we can send the recycling across ourselves. All we need to do is bring out a little bit of steel so that we can add in a few mechanical parts. And since steel plus Electronics 3 is also the input into servers, we've put that manufacturing out here too. Those servers, by the way, are used out here at what we're calling the Coal Ridge Data Center, because that's our big coal mine, I guess. And this facility has 3 petaflops of capacity, but we only need half of that right now. And that is still very comfortably supplying our compute needs At least at this time, but I think for probably some time even if we did choose to continue. Now, the next piece, I told you, our fertilizer exports over here to this drop-off. This is where we make all of our food. These 14 greenhouse 2s all have max fertility, max water, etc. They are as productive as 14 greenhouse 2s can possibly be, and they supply enough crops to give, as I mentioned, our nearly 10,000 citizens all categories of food, raw and refined. And the refining happens out here. Generally, this value chain, so to speak, flows from left to right. We process the raw crops in this area. That turns it into intermediate goods like flour, and then gets turned further into final goods like bread over here. The excess of any of that, if it can be, is first turned into animal feed to keep our chicken farms going. And if it either can't be or there's already enough animal feed, that excess gets sent out here and digested in this set of anaerobic digesters, which is probably wildly overkill, but has been helpful to have this many at various points of the game. That fuel gas that comes out of this set is then turned into hydrogen and backfilled through this array of hydrogen-producing electrolyzers to run via these boilers this massive set of coastal desalinators. These coastal desalinators supply enough water to run all of these very thirsty farms. This was actually one of the more interesting builds for me personally during the playthrough. I don't know if it was for people to watch, that's for them to decide. But for me to build, I kind of had, this was a unique challenge. I knew the logic we wanted for the build. Like I mentioned, priority from, first to raw crop supply, then intermediaries, then finished goods, then animal feed, then anaerobic digestion. But I didn't know how many buildings we would need of each of them. Because food production is pretty hard to do clean math on ahead of time, given you've got variable fertility based on your fertilizer supply, based on the demand for one single food product being a function of whether or not you also supply the other sources in that category. You eat less potatoes if you're also supplying corn, and so on and so forth, right? So it's one in my mind where, like, yeah, you can drive yourself crazy trying to get to a proper answer, going in circles on paper, but like, you're going to have to dial it in based on empirical results anyway. So why not just build, see if you need more, and if you need more, add more. So we did that. We left lots of room to add additional buildings in this area, and it turns out we used a decent amount of that space, but as you can see, not all of it. So if this area looks a little bit less compact than the other various builds that we've done in the other more densely packed urban areas of this map, that's why. So minor digression, slight backstory, but I personally had sort of a fun time with the sort of the challenge of building relatively blind. It wasn't blind, but you understand what I'm saying. So we then send all of these food sources back to the settlement through these two parallel train lines. This larger train and this smaller train both come back, that's what this guy is, and this guy, along this set of tracks here, and in fact we gave them their own dedicated set of tracks here so that they could bypass this region, which again used to have a lot more train traffic, but then comes back here and loops back around itself. Because these food lines are very high throughput and the consumption is, very high, we wanted to make sure that they had their own dedicated setup. Plus it's fun to play with elevated rail, right? So that then brings us all the way back to the market region of our settlement that we already touched on. The final sector to develop then was out here to the east as we filled in this coastline. There was a lot of terraforming required to get this area to be usable in this same way, and so naturally it makes sense that we use these areas for the more advanced productions that we unlocked later in the game, once this region was actually ready to be used. So this block furthest east out here produces titanium and aluminum, right? Both of these have their raw goods supplied directly via contract and primarily supply their outputs to the spaceport in this area here. This spaceport has 2 rocket assembly depots and 2 matching launch pads, which allows us to pretty comfortably maintain the supply runs necessary to sustain our space station. Just to the west of these metal productions, you can see we've added even more steel capacity here, right? You can really never have enough steel in this game, I think. And in addition to that is our gold supply, the primary production of gold, the non-recycled production of gold. This, combined with that recycling array, has been enough to comfortably keep both our microchips and luxury goods stuffed to the gills. A lot of times, decent fractions of this are entirely idle, so this has been plenty, which is also great. Now the gold production here also shares some infrastructure, acid supply, and toxic slurry disposal with what's next door, our nuclear plant, which is a good transition into how we power this whole base, actually. So the vast majority of our power production comes from these 2 sister nuclear plants. The first, out here, is comprised of 2 nuclear reactor 2s, which between the 2 of them at 120 megawatts each, produce 240 megawatts, based on the consumption of the basic nuclear rod fuel. Uranium rod fuel. We produce that here by way of yellow cake from imported uranium ore. The depleted steam, as I mentioned, from all of these turbines then powers this massive array of coastal desalinators, bringing in seawater, of course. This makes, as I mentioned, this whole nuclear plant a net exporter of water to the rest of the base. And so it supplies water for several facilities, several very thirsty facilities, including our second plant over here to the right. This is comprised of 2 fast breeder reactors. One of them is on 1x enrichment, meaning it consumes blanket fuel to regenerate the core fuel it needs, but no more, and the other is on 3x enrichment, meaning it produces excess enriched blanket fuel at the opportunity cost of producing even more power. The one on 1x produces 240 megawatts, and the other still produces a convenient little 60 megawatts, and so between these 2, we produce 300 megawatts. Now if we retooled so that both reactors were at 1x enrichment, we'd have 480 megawatts. Instead though, we use that excess enriched blanket fuel to produce plutonium and enriched uranium 20%, which are the key inputs into the space probe parts and the asteroid booster productions that are required to find and lasso asteroids, respectively. So those productions feed directly into the spaceport. We recycle the spent fuel from these original nuclear plants along this very long line that is definitely still giving us some radiation as a result, but they're recycled out here to turn into blanket fuel. But at the very end of the recycling chain, no matter what we do, is going to be fission product, right? And so we store all of that out here. We're letting that rot in these waste storages for a century until it can be recycled. We lost a lot of good men and women while I was relocating and reprocessing this waste because I was somewhat cavalier about radiation exposure from belts, but hey, give it enough time, they all grow back, so be it. Between these 2 facilities, which we run at max continuously, we don't auto balance any of that, we get 540 megawatts, which is, would you look at that, our rough average consumption, right? But we do have a couple backup facilities on auto balance that spin up when necessary. And the first of those is right next door. This was actually our OG coal power plant, which has definitely evolved over time, but has existed in this location in one form or another since, I think, episode 6. It began as pure coal power, but we also used to train out here even, at different points, excess refinery byproducts, light oil and heavy oil, before we unlocked the techs that allowed us to use them as inputs into those more advanced products. Waste not, want not, after all. Once we unlocked biomass recycling, though, we set this facility up to preferentially take and burn biomass instead of coal. And as you can see, it still does that today, and we definitely have enough biomass that whenever this spins up, it supplies that instead of the coal. So this is here as a backup, but it's pretty rare that we end up using coal here very often. This is just a 45 megawatt, buffer. Generally, though, that ends up being enough between that and our 540 megawatt baseload that nothing else really fires very often. However, our final facility is the 240 megawatt coal power plant that you've probably noticed during the food production segment. This rarely, if ever, fires anymore, but it was critical for bridging the gap to setting up our fast breeder reactor plant. Not only did it provide about half the power that our island needed at one point, this is equal, by the way, to the size of our first nuclear plant and the 2 nuclear reactor 2s installed there, but the excess steam also supplied and backfilled these coastal desalinators before we had stable hydrogen production across our entire base. And that was critical to keep our crops from drying out, right? This water supply was a real pain until we had stable hydrogen production. And so it's pretty quiet these days. And beyond the machines themselves, which are obviously still very much here, the only sign that it used to run as constantly as it did is probably our leftover massive graphite storage, now that I look at it, to keep up with all the exhaust and CO2 scrubbing that we used to have to do here. Realistically, we could probably shutter at least half of this facility to save on maintenance and workers, but hey, we can afford it at this point, and I still, as you can probably tell, reading between the lines, have a bit of PTSD about chasing power and water supplies, and so I've been more comfortable just leaving it go. That's the last big facility worth showing, I think, but we should elevate and talk about how we're sourcing our raw materials, looking at this cargo dock. I figure it's more important to have this conversation once in more depth rather than having it, over and over again at each of these little factories, talking about where all of these supplies come from. So I've sort of mentioned offhand already that we've moved pretty aggressively towards a contract-based economy. And so we trade, for example, vehicle parts 2 for the entirety of our crude oil supply. That's all that comes through here is supplied via the vehicle parts 2 trade. We also use that to supplement our iron ore import. So we do still bring in from iron mines out this way a decent amount of iron ore supplying these 2 areas. But as you probably noticed, this supplemental steel production out here uses imported iron. That imported iron is also, as I mentioned, a vehicle parts 2 export. We also use vehicle parts 2 export for the very small volume of imported goods that we bring in. I believe it's here. In fact, it is. These are, of course, required to mix with gold to supply the luxury goods. What else do we use? Well, we use vehicle parts 3 for coal. That's what this trade was, still is. And we don't use it very much anymore, as I mentioned, since our massive coal plant that's out here isn't running very often, but it is still good to have a backup supply of coal that is available to the rest of the base, especially given that we are kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel on this coal mine here, still on the island. We also export sulfur for coal, but this is a safety release valve so that if we cap on sulfur at the refinery, right, we don't back up and stop producing the ammonia that we still need. So this, which is out here, is not about supplying coal. It's about finding a productive way to dispose of excess sulfur. Similarly, I think I already mentioned the use of slag exporting for sour water on occasion. The other thing that we do actually right next door is we export household appliances for copper. This is only to supply the advanced electronics factory, at least for now, because we do need that copper out here for this array as well, but we bring that in via train from this mine up here. The other thing that we export household appliances for is logs, wood. In fact, fun fact, we haven't planted a single tree this entire playthrough. We cut down all the trees that we could reach on the island, everywhere, and then, when they were all gone, we deleted our tree harvesters and we just started importing logs. Much easier. Of course, as I mentioned, we also import both our bauxite for aluminum production and titanium ore for our titanium production using these irresponsibly cheap and valuable construction parts for contracts. We do still, as I've gestured to a couple times, have a few mines still open. There's this coal mine, at least for now. There's this copper mine. This had been a depleted iron mine, and we were in fact working our way through this one. And then this was the asteroid we slammed down. We figured, well, it's an iron asteroid, and this used to be an iron mine, and in fact, it's much closer to this train station than the existing iron mine was, so why wouldn't we switch to it, I suppose. The other mines that we have open, I would say, in this sort of western zone are the limestone deposit that's out here. It's so massive. There's all of this quartz here that we have to double grind into sand. And because this area used to all be water and we've filled it in, you can also then see that by doing that, we've made accessible all of the sand that's in this area. And I don't know, it looks weird. It's not my favorite, most aesthetic part of the base, but it's a lot of sand. And quartz is fine, but it takes all of this processing to give you sand. So we're at least supplementing it here, at least for now. The final mine that we have set up out here is primarily for gold, and we run that on a train single track right here, very straightforward. And eventually, if we keep going in this region, we'll also start to pull in bits of titanium and bauxite, so we'll keep those drop-offs accessible to trucks, but generally speaking, I think we'll still be importing most of it from our contracts. The other thing that we can do for gold, by the way, when it runs out, and we've left room for this already, is import its ore supply as well. There's room for a full-size cargo dock right here, which we sketched out to make sure would be true. And there is a lovely contract that exports a very small number of servers for a pretty decent amount of gold ore. And the last thing that's probably worth mentioning is that we currently supply our uranium for both of our power plants, I guess indirectly, at least for the second one, through this uranium ore mine. And it's getting low, right? Out on the world map. There's another one out on the world map. There's also contracts that we can explore here as well. And I think now that we're more or less done, at least with, valuable continuous research, this would be a half decent one to consider. But we still have some time before we're forced to make that decision, and those are less valuable trades. So, last couple odds and ends, I suppose, worth calling out. The first is that our overall transportation network is sadly down to just 8 train lines for now, most of which transport ore, or they go to or from the farming setup for fertilizer supply and food return, respectively. I think the only exception to that, is our Electronics 2 shuttle. So As we've moved away, as I mentioned, from mining and towards contracts, trains just aren't as necessary. I don't need to transport, for example, the iron ore from this cargo dock to this facility if I just build this facility right next to the cargo dock. So it's just taken on less importance over time, based on the way that our base has evolved, but also I think based on the way that the overall economic meta of Captain of Industry sort of, let's say, influences you to shift towards. As far as our active edicts, we actually have nothing on the population side, although we certainly can afford to and have on occasion cranked up the extra food, household goods, appliances, electronics edicts when we need the extra unity, although we generally don't need it too much. On the industrial side, we absolutely overload our trucks. We absolutely crank recycling up to the max. We absolutely reduce maintenance. With our extra unity from there, farm yields is helpful. Why not? We certainly have the water supply out there, as I mentioned, and we can save a little bit on water supply over here as well, just so that you have those in mind. And then the other thing that we did in the office, we found these bonuses, I would say in general, a bit underwhelming for the population cost. So we shuttered our office for most of our playthrough, but now that we have the pops and nothing else to really do with them, we are using them and the compute boost, since we have so much extra capacity there, to get a bunch of points to increase our truck capacity. This one is very valuable for us, for sure. That said, anytime we have population issues, this is the first thing I shutter, sadly. So it is what it is. I think this is one of the areas that could use a bit more balance, but we'll see how that all shakes out. So last thing I'll say, as we've sort of taken you around the base, is, what would we do if we were to keep playing? What would be sort of our next steps? What would be the things that we want to handle? We never converted to hydrogen vehicles or trains. We're already there on all of our cargo ships. These are all supplied via hydrogen. So we're a lot of the way there in that sense. And I know people like doing this to see the pollution line go to zero, but I haven't prioritized it yet because I don't generally think it's quote unquote worth it, since we'd need to retool the refinery again to pivot away from diesel. We'd have to swap out all of our refueling infrastructure and rebuild all of our trains. I don't think that that's necessarily worth the small, I guess, indirect health and unity bonus that you get for reducing the pollution. But we're also at the stage now where we can afford to do anything we want, regardless. And as always, I'll never tell you how to play. If you want to do something, you should do it, regardless of whether or not it's considered min-max. So that, I would say, would be the next big-ish project that I would want to tackle in this base. The other big transition is what to do as our next set of mines dry up, right? And I'm of two minds here. One, mining is still fun, right? And it's really where these trains shine the most. And I think there's something satisfying about scraping out all of the resources from the island. And I don't know, that's its own dopamine hit worth of value, right? But two, the second mind I am also of, I guess, is, man, yeah, contracts are just simpler, they're better value, and they are infinitely sustainable. So, like I said, with golds, I think we have at least we'll back up with the contract. But, with coal, there's another mine out here. We could set up a mining operation out in this zone with its own proper train station. It's too far at this point. There's a bunch of stuff out here. There's coal is here, as we already mentioned. This is an iron mine. There's also uranium, right? And a ton of sand, gold, limestone, lots of little stuff out here. So we could set up a big old mine out there. I think I would consider that doing it for fun rather than because I think it's a good strategic move. But I think that we would have to more sustainably solve our uranium supply, particularly as a pretty near term, short to medium term priority as well. And then finally, there's a million decorative and aesthetic odds and ends that I could play around with forever. We never built the Tomb of Captains since we have the supporter pack, but there's still so much to terraform and pave and so on and so forth. Like I said, I had to draw the line somewhere so that we can move on to another game because there's so much more awesome stuff out there too. But like I said, I forced myself to stop on January 1st, 1000 for exactly that reason. And in fact, as you can see, I'm still paving like mad, and I even took some pretty hefty concrete slab loans just to get it looking as shiny as I could before we hit our cutoff date. So still plenty we could do, but I think we're at the point where there's nothing we have to do, and so we'll leave it here. So I think that wraps up the tour component. And I know I editorialized a little bit in there, here and there, but I think at this point it's probably proper to transition into, I guess, sort of the review points. I don't know that I'm going to call this necessarily a review. It's more like my reflections, my reactions, my thoughts, and then some tips and tricks in case that's helpful to you as well. Okay, so my reflections after 200 hours of this playthrough and the, I guess, several hundred hours that I had in the game before. But I think overall, there's just a million great things to say about this game. I can't possibly list them all. So I'm going to share some of the highlights and then the things that have been on my mind as I've been reflecting on this series. The first thing I want to say is the dev team for this game is incredible. They are highly responsive to and in tune with user feedback. They work fast, but never at the expense of being sloppy. And they come up with really cool creative solutions to a lot of the design questions and problems that pop up when you're thinking about developing this game. The other thing I'll say is that the interaction with terrain remains one of my favorite parts of this game. It's so cool to watch the island change shape over the course of your playthrough and to mold it into whatever you want it to be. It is a sandbox game in the most literal sense of the word. The other point I wanted to make is designing builds in this game is so much fun. You can accidentally spend hours on pause sketching out future builds, but it isn't just that it's immersive, it's that the toolkit they give you is a great balance of powerful, but still relatively simple and intuitive ways to approach creating pretty complex builds. And the feeling of building and turning everything on afterwards, and the system works perfectly on the first try, just as you designed it? Well, I'm still chasing that particular feeling, but I'm sure I'll get it one day. I bet it's great though. It's very satisfying watching something you dreamed up power on and come to life, even if you do have to spend the first few minutes figuring out where you missed a pipe connection first. That might just be a me problem though. The last big point I want to make overall is it's a really well-balanced game. There are tons of totally viable different ways to build your overall system. There are very few objectively correct answers, and the decision is more about which trade-offs fit your base at that moment, which means making interesting choices and that you have a high degree of replayability. This game forces you to make interesting choices is the highest praise I can give a game. Like, that's what we're here for, right? And then on the Update 3 developments specifically, so trains and the space program. So I'll go a little bit deeper on that in this section. Trains are an awesome addition with a bright future, but I do think they need a little bit of user experience, intuition, ease of use work. The system is powerful and probably capable of doing whatever you want it to do, but it can be difficult, especially early on, to figure out how to make that happen. I'll start with the good, because there's a lot of good in this. Fundamentally, trains add a tool to your logistics network, which is great on its own merits. They also add a great aesthetic layer to making the base feel alive. Trucks are great for that too, in like a swarm of bees type of way, but this adds something larger and more continuous moving through the map, and the tracks themselves add something to build around and to plan around. I also love, from a design perspective, the innovation of loading multiple cars at the same station module. This does two things. One, it reduces the footprint of your builds, and you just saw the base tour, you know I love compact builds. But two, it also adds a ton of flexibility to how you ship things around your island. Since not every train has to be perfectly aligned to every train station, it can still function just fine, and it gives you a lot more options without having to configure every specific individual train station to be specific to the train, and allows you to adjust which trains you're sending where much more simply. I think it's doubly impressive how well this function works with absolutely zero input from the player. It's one of the more user-friendly parts of the system, despite being presumably one of the more complex parts on the back end to develop. If some early UX bumps and bruises were the cost of getting the fundamentals of this system right, which is pure conjecture on my part, but my best guess from where I'm sitting, I'll take that trade any day. I also love the design choice of longer is better, which the devs were pretty explicit about at launch and got even more explicit about with some of the balance changes they made after launch, increasing the throughput of the train depot extension and so on and so forth. If you find that you're struggling to make good use of trains in your playthrough, this is a great place to start reevaluating how you use them. With very few exceptions, the shortest trains we built in this entire playthrough were 8 cars long, and most were in the more like 10, 12, 16 range. This is doubly true once you get to mega vehicles in the later stages of the game. Trains must be long to add much value. Of course, they always exist as a way to add transport network capacity without counting against the vehicle cap, and that's important. But in general, I do find that trains kind of peak in value in the middle of the game. Once mega vehicles come in and you have the ability to boost truck capacity, they really drop off by comparison. The basic pickup, right? The blue trucks you start the game with have a capacity of 20. So that means you need 6 of those trips to equal 1 train car. And of course, a train runs many cars. The yellow trucks have a capacity of 60. So that's 2 per train car. So they're still better, of course, than running a whole bunch of yellow trucks. But a mega vehicle at 180 capacity is 1.5 train cars itself. There are also more and better ways to boost truck capacity than train capacity currently in the game. With edicts and the office focus points that we're currently running, our mega trucks are worth almost 2.5 train cars each. And so if you have a 10-car train, which is decently sized, I could just run 4 mega trucks instead. I would still prefer to run the train, but the relative capacity comparison really drops off. I think that trains could use better, cheaper, more accessible ways to boost their capacity to offset this, but I think those tools are still a little underwhelming compared to their truck counterparts. So in order to have much value later in the game, they either have to be super long ore trains, which we definitely have, or they have to transport flat goods, since there isn't a flat good mega truck. Now, we didn't set our base up very well for that, for late game flat trains. Maybe we will next playthrough, but that's really the only thing that's keeping our Electronics 2 shuttle a reasonable use of our time. But generally speaking, the way that we've built our base in this sort of dense, urban, compact way, it's pretty hard to have trains running up and down Broad Street when it's much simpler to have the trucks making that short last mile delivery. And then so on some constructive feedback points, and as I mentioned, it's mostly centered on making a cool and powerful system more intuitive and easier to use. And I want to start by saying it's really important to keep in mind, train networks are notoriously difficult to program into a game. Pathfinding and scheduling alone are a nightmare, and we, the players, expect things to just work. And there's a trade-off between giving the player more control over the system, because that also requires more input from the player to calibrate it to do what you want. And it should be said, it requires more correct input from the player. A high control system is only as good as the player's understanding of it. And so, in general, I think the Captain of Industry devs made a concerted effort to create something that has the power of a high control system without all of the manual player intervention that's typically required to calibrate a high control network. I like that philosophy generally, and there are some spots where it really does work well. The multiple train cars loading and unloading at a single station module is, again, really cool, powerful, and flexible, while requiring essentially zero calibration or management from me, the player. That said though, if it sounds like trying to have your cake and eat it too, well, where it can break down is when no input required from the player turns into no visibility into the system when you're troubleshooting. which ironically makes things frustrating and complex when the intent was to make them simple and easy. I think this is most visible, to me at least, with train traffic. Troubleshooting train traffic, especially when you're still learning the system, is very unintuitive. The train blocks visualizer improvements are a helpful starting place, but it's still difficult at times to understand why a train is, for example, waiting for a free track when it looks to the untrained eye, no pun intended, like there should be a track available. And the tool we're supposed to use to solve traffic issues, exclusive zones, I find is particularly unintuitive, both in general, but also especially when you're troubleshooting. Now, you'll find a whole bunch of very helpful guides out there about how to park or queue trains to keep them from clogging up the main travel tracks. In my opinion, that's a pretty convoluted workaround and takes a large amount of extra space and infrastructure. So the ability, for example, to give explicit priority to certain trains or train lines would be very welcome instead, i.e. increase the degree of control that we give the player. So these traffic concerns, combined with the longer the better train design choice, means unfortunately, as I mentioned, they're pretty limited in these more urban manufacturing environments, which is admittedly my personal design preference, and they are instead best for raw resource transport over long, undeveloped distances, which is admittedly clearly been their vision from the start. But I'd love to see them become more flexible instead of being restricted to that narrow use case. I think it's very cool to see them snaking their way through busy areas, and I'd love if they were also viable in that situation as well. I also find that, in an unfortunate contrast to how fun and easy building factories is, building train tracks is more painful than it needs to be. From the way trucks still sometimes build one tiny segment at a time, to the difficulty visualizing when one segment is missing or overlapping, to the general difficulty tracks have with sloped ground, there's lots of little bits of friction that can add up to be rather frustrating. I've particularly found going up and curving at the same time is pretty difficult to make look good. And I would absolutely love to see a parallel track building mode, which you can see in other games. Another point is you can build tracks at any angle, which is great, but crossings are limited to the north-south and east-west orientations squared up against the grid. This forces you to build train networks that are either maximally straight with the shortest, tightest 90-degree turns possible, which slows trains when they enter the corners, right? Or accept that you'll be in conflict with your road network in certain areas. Either you won't have crossings in areas where those tracks are not on the compass marks, north, south, east, west, or you'll have to elevate the tracks to give enough clearance for most, but not all, largest vehicles to go under. And in any case, you basically have to decide between slowing down your trains or slowing down your trucks. Now, someone in the comments below will post that actually if you build an elevated track at level 5 and then dig a trench a few levels underneath it, technically you can get enough clearance for a mega vehicle to pass through. And that's super creative, and I'm very impressed when people go through that effort. But just like with burying pipes, for me personally, if the answer involves unintended uses for terraforming, right on, you do you. But I feel like we've lost the plot a little bit. There's got to be a better way to solve that. That said though, I don't really know what you do with this one. The grid is pretty fundamental to the game's structure. Nothing else can be built on a diagonal, so we might just have to live with this one. And hey, I'll happily concede that obviously, since this was our first Update 3 playthrough, this was my first time using the train system, and so naturally I learned a lot along the way. And we did eventually manage to build a rail network that works pretty well. So get good / user error is a fine counter-argument. With no changes whatsoever, I'll certainly be able to set up a better network from the start next time than I did this time. However, I'm also a firm believer in the user experience mantra that there is no such thing as user error, meaning that if the user can't figure out your system, that itself is a flaw of your system. Being intuitive and accessible is part of being a good system. So, in summary, on all of these points of constructive feedback, I think a few things are all true at once. 1, they've created a powerful, robust, and innovative system that is immediately well incorporated into the game, and the game is far better off for those efforts. 2, as I understand it, train systems and logic notoriously difficult to build, and doubly so if the game isn't designed around trains from the start. And while I certainly think trains fit well into this game, it's also fair to say that Captain of Industry is not Transport Fever, Railroad Empire, etc., right? 3, all of that said, these things have all been done before in quite a few other games, so it's very much possible. It's just about adapting it to Captain of Industry specifically. And as I said, I'm confident it'll get there, and I'm excited to try out that next iteration. Still, to be clear, overall, an awesome addition with a bright future. A+ on trains. The space program, the other Update 3 highlight, is also an interesting start. But asteroids feel like one of the few objectively worse options in the game. With respect, I mean to sourcing late game ores, compared to contracts. At first, the pitch sounds good. Asteroids fix the most visible downside to your island's starting mining operations, right? The fact that they're finite, and it eliminates it. It makes mining infinitely sustainable. It's an expensive investment to get there, but you can casually drop 1 million more ore onto your island whenever your mines are running low. When you sketch it out, though, in a little bit more detail, contracts win head-to-head in every situation, I think. Contracts have lower direct resource costs per unit of ore. Contracts just cost what you're exporting, right? Typically a small amount of a manufactured good, and a negligible amount of Unity per trip, whereas asteroids cost space probe and asteroid booster parts. Those are both made of very valuable late game components. Titanium, electronics 4, downstream products, plutonium and enriched uranium that come from enriched blanket fuel. That's a lot of very valuable stuff that goes into every single asteroid capture process. Contracts also have lower supporting infrastructure costs. Contracts require operating a boat and a cargo dock, plus some Unity just to keep the contract active. That's it. Asteroids, on the other hand, require a space station, pretty high level one typically as well, to have enough boosters stored up there to bring down any asteroid of any reasonable size. So you need a high level space station. To make those parts, you need a fast breeder reactor, and it should be said, a fast breeder reactor not dedicated as much to generating power, which is an opportunity cost. You also have to run all of the plutonium and enriched uranium post-processing. You have to operate all the rockets required to get everything up to the station, the space probe parts, the asteroid boosters, and everything else just to maintain that same space station. It goes on and on. And once you land the asteroid itself, you still have to run a mining crew, and probably the train infrastructure to transport it across the island, unless you're a madman who dropped the asteroid right next to your industry. It's kind of a lot just to keep mining going, right? And in addition to what I think is objectively better value, contracts are also set and forget, requiring no additional or ongoing input from you. For example, I genuinely forgot we were importing wood until I reviewed our contracts for this video. We set it up a while ago. It's just that low maintenance. I don't say this because I'm lazy, I say this because attention is also a resource, and particularly that's true in the late game here when you're juggling a massive, sprawling system. So to be clear, this stance is more that contracts are too good than it is that asteroids are bad. And to be clear, asteroids are fun is all the excuse you need to use them. These comments are limited to the game's strategic balance. I'm only hammering this point so much because if contracts are essentially universally superior to their alternatives, that goes against the making interesting choices and replayability pillars that I laid out as the core, in my mind, of a great sandbox game. I get why contracts need to exist, right? We have finite deposits and world mines, and this allows you to play infinitely, but I honestly wouldn't mind if the devs made contracts more expensive to maintain so that it's not such an obvious choice in all situations. Until then though, fortunately, they're optional, so maybe I'll do a contract-free challenge run at some point. Okay, so with those reflections out of the way, the last section I wanted to cover quickly is some tips and tricks that I'd like to share on the off chance you might find them helpful. 2 quick points up front. 1. I'm definitely more of a gaming generalist and certainly not a captain of industry specialist, so a lot of what I'm about to say is actually pretty generalizable to other games, and beyond gaming frankly, as well. But of course, I'll tailor this advice as it applies to captain of industry specifically. And 2, as always, these are here to help you play more efficiently, but efficiency is only important in service of giving you more power to shape the game the way you want to play it. So, take from these what you will. I will not be offended if you don't take everything, and I don't even suggest that you take everything. Take what fits into your playstyle and enhances it. So, the first tip I will give is that you should always build your systems with flexibility. So the prime example I like to give in our base is the use of priority balancers. And we use these many places, but in our construction parts factory, we use priority balancers to adjust the shape of this factory based on the current needs of the base. For example, this key input here is electronics 1. Now we use electronics 1 as part of the production of construction parts 2. That's an important output that we need to give our electronics to. It's also a key input over here to maintenance, right? maintenance is also a pretty important part of our economy. It's also exported out to the rest of the base. Now, the way that we have prioritized this sort of by default is, well, what's the most important thing here? Generally speaking, maintenance is more important than anything else that this set feeds into. Construction parts, we can always wait, right? You can even take a loan. You can't take a maintenance loan. And maintenance, if it runs out, everything starts breaking. That's the most important thing. And so, what we do is we say, well, if we want to prioritize maintenance, we will prioritize this output, and then from here, we will prioritize this output that goes to maintenance instead of out here to construction parts. But let's say that something has gone terribly wrong. And sure, we're fine on maintenance, but wow, we really need to, I don't know, quickly pay down a construction parts 2 loan or something, right? Great, no problem. Done, right? Remember to switch it back. But that gives us flexibility. Additionally, we can also choose to prioritize any of the outputs here to the rest of the base. This is something that I've had to do on occasion when we run out, say, over here for vehicle parts because we need to export these to get oil, right? Let's say we have a crude oil crisis, and that's because we don't have vehicle parts, which is because we don't have electronics. Well, great, no problem. We can quickly surge and prioritize out here. We use this balancer priority flexibility in many places around the base. Others that come to mind: do we prioritize our limited silica poly to go to microchips or to electronics 2? We have a million priority balancers in this refinery, and even looking at how we use heavy oil, for example, we want to first run it through the boilers. If the boilers are full, well, we'd like to crack it down into naphtha, and if our naphtha is full, well, we'd like to crack it down into diesel, right? And all of that, and you can't really see it very well because it's under all these pipes, but all of that is enforced through a series of pipe balancers. So these conditional logic flows are very important, not just for setting things up the way that you want them to run permanently, but so that you can make adjustments as crises or changing conditions in your base dictate. Same thing is here even with supplying the electronics, right? Our copper prioritizes out to it there right now, but if we desperately needed it elsewhere, we could change that too. None of these require us to build or delete anything, just to change some settings. This is a game about reacting and adjusting, and flexibility is an important strategic tool. The second thing that I'll say about maintaining flexibility is in using Unity, right? And so, as you can see, we are currently boosting this entire setup. That was a temporary decision based on a temporary need that I had, which was to try to pave all of this before my year marker ticked over and I forced myself to film this video. We don't actually need this much concrete in general, but a paving blitz and the loans that I took to afford that paving blitz dictate that I probably need to elevate my production. No problem. We have lots of Unity. And in fact, as a meta strategic point here, we have prioritized generating a ton of Unity by supplying all of these goods to our people. Now, of course, if you're surging something infinitely, or at least for a very, very long time, that's not a temporary fix. You just need to build a bigger factory, right? So at that point, you're simply wasting Unity. But because this is a temporary need, this is a great tool for that temporary fix. Third point on flexibility. You should maintain strategic buffers, but only for goods with cyclic or spiky consumption. Don't hoard for the sake of hoarding. It's a very human thing to say, oh, well, these are valuable goods, and the more I have in my big stockpile, the better, the richer I must be, right? That's not actually a good use of your resources in the game. So construction parts is, I think, the prime example of where this is good to do. So think about the usage requirements for construction parts. Does anything consume them continuously? Not at all, right? So our baseline consumption is 0. But let's say we need to slap down a new reactor. Well, that costs 1,500 construction parts too. Okay, construction parts 4. Well, good thing that we have 5K here, right? It would be bad if we didn't. If we only had a small storage, that would be a problem. So the spiky nature of the consumption of these goods, and in fact, you can see this in the consumption graphs, right? This is a prime candidate for where it is good to maintain a strategic buffer. Now, you don't see me with 4 of these, but I think 1 level 4 storage is a pretty reasonable thing to build. Anything else that is essentially a construction material, if not explicitly a construction part, here I'm thinking about, for example, rail parts, right? You generally need a lot of rail parts when you're adding an entire rail line. In some cases, actually, coming back to concrete, right? I mean, it is continuously consumed for the production of construction parts, but a lot of what we do is, I remember to pave an entire sector all of a sudden, and now we have a very spiky consumption. The opposite of that, though, are things like mechanical parts for maintenance. These are consumed continuously, right? Now there's a minor strategic value in having a small buffer here, I suppose, in case your steel supply is disrupted. But it's not that big of a value. Like, how often does that really happen? And if that's really happening, you should fix the core of that issue. Most of the time, that buffer is simply going to be resources you produced but don't get any value out of, right? And you can even see this in the way that we've done, coming back to it, our electronics. We don't have a storage here. If we stop running this, if we don't produce continuously electronics, our maintenance is going to suffer for that, right? So again, there are some places where it's worth doing and others where it's not. It just comes down to what is your consumption pattern and how critical is the good? What are the consequences? So I practice what I preach, and you can look around this base and there are, you won't see a big stockpile, a big warehouse with tons of anything, really. With very few exceptions, I don't think that we have more than 1, maybe 2 storage level 4s of any good anywhere on this island. Pay no attention to the limestone and sand behind the curtain. That was for something else. Generally speaking, one of these is good, and any more than that, and you're quietly shooting yourself in the foot because of the both direct and opportunity cost of creating a pile of goods you will do nothing with. The second big tip that I want to spend some time on is think in different time horizons. In the short term, you have a lot of tools to get out of a pinch, right? Don't be afraid to use them, but be smart with them. We already talked about using Unity as a short-term boost, but how it's very much not a long-term strategy. But we should also mention loans. You should take loans. I take loans. If they enable you to grow faster than the interest rate you pay, which, yeah, it will. These are good interest rates, and you can grow very fast. Take these loans, right? Now, use them to grow so that you can pay back the loans, but you should make use of these. You are leaving value on the table if you don't. If, let's say, you're caught in a catch-22 loop, even if it's not about growing faster, if you're in a catch-22 loop because your steel factory broke down because you don't have enough maintenance, but you can't regenerate your maintenance because you're out of steel as an input, take a steel loan. That's what that's there for. That will solve your problem. You'll be able to pay it back, right? Now, conversely, but similar principle, don't be afraid to pause productions or maybe particularly research, right? In the short term, if you're having, let's go back to it, a steel crisis, stop spending steel to research, I don't know, solar panels. That doesn't help you solve your problem. And in fact, it makes it worse in the meanwhile because you are keeping a high demand of steel to produce something that doesn't solve your problem. Just remember to turn everything back on afterwards, right? Now, in more the medium to longer term, you should look ahead in the tech tree, for example, to know where the big jumps are. Think about what your fundamental drivers of success are going to be. Know that, trains are coming. I need to make sure that I have vehicle parts 2 production coming, and that means I need more steel coming, right? Another great example is electronics, right? This whole value chain scales up pretty quickly. Once it comes onto the scene, it goes into everything. You start putting electronics 2 into everything that you will make at that point. And so that means you're going to need a lot of copper. You should put it down before you try to produce it, right? Know what's coming, and you will make your path that much smoother. This sort of dovetails into another point, which is understand what the pillars of your economy are. And I think copper is a really big one, and understand sort of what that time course looks like. You don't need much right away at the very beginning of the game, but then wow, does it ever accelerate. Steel is something that you will need way more of than you think pretty much constantly. You should always be adding more steel than you probably think you need, right? And because I'm telling you to build a whole bunch of consumption capacity, you should also be proactive about your materials sourcing strategy. And by that I mean, start the next iron mine before the first one dries up. Don't get caught, like we did multiple times in this playthrough, in the middle of a transition. We were trying to do a big old build when we ran out of a coal mine that used to be here, and I had to slap one together up here. It's not fun to be doing that while you're also trying to juggle a bunch of other stuff. It's also not very efficient. So if you're about to run out of an iron mine, start the next one first. If you're running low on a coal mine, remember, there are coal mines out on the map. There are contracts. In general, if you can have multiple sources, if you can diversify where you're pulling your goods from, you won't have a single point of failure for any of them. The other long-term lens that you should probably take is terraforming. It's one of my favorite parts of this game. But it takes forever. It takes forever to do what you want to do. And so you have to think in the longer term about overall expansion, right? Where do you need more land? Where do you need something to not be a mountain? Over here, for example. This took quite some time. And it takes even longer until you have mega vehicles, which, by the way, is most of the game is before that. So these are the sort of things where you don't want to be reactively terraforming, you want to be out ahead of this. It's also the sort of thing where, in a crisis, if you say are running low on coal and you need to put a couple more excavators into that mine, you're going to take them off terraforming. So it never goes as quickly as you plan it to, either. In general, sort of dovetailing off of that too, it's better to move slowly and carefully in a game like this because there are death loops and too many balls to try to keep up in the air, and it's a big system that is so interconnected with all the other parts of the system, which is a great thing, right? But it means that if you try to change one thing, it's going to have an impact on 3 other things. So if you try to change 3 things at once, it's going to have an impact on 9 things, probably more, right? That's how many balls you have to keep up in the air. So generally, it's better to move too slow than too fast. Change one big thing at a time. It's easier to tell what's gone wrong, and it's easier to rebalance. I will also say, before you take a big project, take a little bit of time to recharge your buffers. Construction parts are important, of course, but Unity is also a really important resource to keep a large buffer of as well, because it allows you to quickly fix mistakes, to boost things if you need to get through, if you need to quickly disassemble and reassemble something because you're breaking a core production by improving it in the short term. Unity is super helpful there. So charge up your buffers before a big project. Use that time to plan the project a little bit more, evaluate your long-term strategy and thinking, or something I'm personally always a bit behind on, tidy up, decorate your base. It's fun. And I think maybe one thing to say more explicitly, because it sounds like I'm being a bit a bit too calculating here at some level is, yes, you should plan for the long term and build with the future in mind, but don't be afraid to tear something down and rebuild it either. Like, that's going to happen. Not everything is going to be a perfect permanent build. And sure, I showed off a few things in our base that did stand the test of time. You know why I'm not showing off the things that didn't? They're not here anymore. That's how that works. So if something doesn't work, tear it down, rebuild it. No big deal. That's part of the fun of the game. You can even play with full refund costs if you like. And then finally, just to emphasize it one last time, have fun and play the game the way that you want to play it. I've said it a couple times now, but there's no wrong way to play. Learning what others define as the meta can be helpful for understanding the game's systems, but it's absolutely not the only way to play. Don't let anyone, including me, put limits on your creativity. I was lukewarm on asteroids just now, but if you really want to build a space trebuchet that flings asteroids down into the ocean 6 times a day, you should do that. I ripped on solar panels for being terrible and weak for most of our playthrough, and I still feel that way. But if you want to do solar only as like a challenge run or something, you should do it. One day maybe I will too. Video games are an art and a medium for self-expression. So let others inspire your creative expression, not dictate it. With that though, that's a wrap on Season 1 of Captain of Industry at Charles Circle. Before I sign off, I did want to say thanks to the folks who made this series possible. First, the devs who put together this brilliant game that we're all coming together about, right? But also each and every one of you who's tuned in so far. You're the inspiration and the motivation for what we're doing here, and thanks to you all, I'm somehow even more energized at the end of this playthrough than I was at the start. If you've made it this far into the video but haven't seen the series, it might be of interest to you. No pressure, but we'll link it to you at the end, just for you, just in case. We'll be kicking off a new series in a different game shortly, so stay tuned. Until then though, have a great rest of your day, and bye-bye.